After studying illustration at Staffordshire University, Michelle Harrison started her career in children's publishing, working as a children's bookseller, and later an assistant editor for a children's book publisher, although she now writes full-time. Her debut novel, The 13 Treasures, won the Waterstones Children's Book Prize in 2009 and has been sold for translation in 17 countries. Her novel, The Other Alice, won the Calderdale Book of the Year award in 2017. Michelle met recently with Nikki Gamble to talk about her latest title, A Pinch of Magic.
I wanted to start really by, first of all, welcoming you and asking whether you would just set the book up for us and tell us, for our listeners, a little bit about the story.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on here. So A Pinch of Magic is all about three sisters, the Widdowson sisters, Betty, Fliss and Charlie. And they're a very unlucky family, and they find out that they're even unluckier than they thought. They discover that they're under a family curse, so they can't leave the island that they live on. But on Betty's 13th birthday, they also get handed down 3 gifts from their family, from their grandmother, which are magical objects, and they use these objects to try and break their curse.
It's a very exciting story indeed, and as we're talking about the title, A Pinch of Magic, let's start with magic as our way into this. I think magical stories can be quite challenging. You know, when children write about magic often just sets everything right for them, you know, and then that's quite hard with a story, isn't it, if the magic can just put everything right. So what do you have to think about when you're writing a story that has magical elements in it?
I think you have to think about the limitations, because if magic can just solve everything, there's no story. So the objects in Pinch of Magic, they can all do certain things. So for instance, there's a bag that will allow you to travel anywhere in the blink of an eye, but it can't do anything else. And there's a mirror, a looking glass, that allows you to see or spy or speak to anyone that you want to see. So you've got these objects that can do certain things. But again, there are those limitations. And the really fun thing about working with stories that deal with magic is that magic quite often leads to more problems. And the girls discover this when they start to mess around with the objects, and it gets them into quite a few tricky situations. So that's a really fun thing about magic. And I remember when I first started to become interested in magic and what it could do, when I was at college, my tutor showed me this picture of fairies from the story Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens, and seeing these magical creatures in a realistic, real-world environment made it seem all the more magical. So it's a bit like the children in Narnia in like a big old house, and they're not expecting to do anything other than play hide and seek, and they open something very ordinary and everyday, the wardrobe, and then discover this magical land inside. So for me, magic is most magical when it's in a world that's ordinary and believable, bringing magic into it rather than having everything magical.
That's interesting, because I think Alan Garner wrote about that in an essay. He was talking about mandrakes and how they're much more frightening if they're roaming the Cheshire countryside than if they're in a completely fantastical world.
Yeah.
And that's that notion of bringing it in to the real world.
Yeah, I think when you see it in an environment that's familiar to you, and you see that element of, oh gosh, that could really happen, that's what makes it scary and exciting at the same time. And that's why it sounds a bit weird as somebody who writes magical books, but I'm quite funny about what I read that's magical. I tend to read a lot more real life books. I mean, I'm reading a magical book at the moment. But things, I think stuff like Harry Potter works because you start off and you see him living in a cupboard under the stairs, and having a really miserable life with his ordinary aunt and uncle, and then the magic is introduced into it. I think if we were introduced straight away to Hogwarts, it wouldn't have the same appeal or effect.
That's interesting. And what you were talking about, having to have some wisdom or control in order to manage the magic. So your characters, in a way, have to grow, don't they, in order to become wise users of magic?
They have to use their brains, and they can't just allow the magic or expect the magic to solve all their problems. They have to really work at how they're going to undo this curse. And they've been told that these objects, they're not supposed to have them until they're 16, because obviously that there's a saying, with great power comes great responsibility. And the youngest of the Widdershins girls, Charlie, is only 6, so all she's interested in is her next meal and whatever animal she's going to adopt next. So she's not really ready for that level of responsibility in her life.
Let's talk for a moment about the middle sister, who's called Betty.
Yeah.
And really she's the main protagonist in this story. She has a sense of adventure. She wants to leave the island where she's growing up, and that's when she discovers a curse that she's not actually allowed to leave. And there's a sense of pulling in two directions here, the wanting to go away, and then the recognition that home actually is a good place to, and your family is a good place to be.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that as a main theme running through the book.
Betty is, she's very much based on my own middle sister, who did go off and do quite a few crazy things when she was younger. She just wanted to escape this kind of small town that we lived in, and go off and meet new people and go on to bigger, brighter, better things. She actually went off and lived in a cave for a while in Corfu.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's quite crazy.
Yeah, she was. She's back now. She's a bit more kind of homely and sensible now, but her younger daughter seems to have picked up that adventurous streak as well. She travelled the world and went all over the place and got lost for a while, and my sister was trying to track her down Liam Neeson style, like in Taken, when she went off the grid for a week. But so Betty's sort of very much based on my middle sister Janet, and I think the thing with Betty is she's a practical one, and she kind of feels like they're all in their different roles, the sisters. So there's something with a lot of middle children that I think they feel overlooked, because the first child is a first child, and they've got used to a lot of attention, and then obviously the younger child comes along and then takes a lot of that attention as well. So to Betty, Fliss is the pretty one that she's always falling in love and getting a lot of attention that way. Betty also feels that Fliss was her dad's favourite, and Charlie is the one that they both mother, and Charlie's sort of the sweet one, the younger one, and there's a sense of responsibility there for her. And I think Betty just feels like she's the plain one that sort of anyone's not really interested in her, and she kind of just wants to escape. She's always got this yearning for adventure, and all she's getting from Granny is excuses or outright lies. We have been out, we've been to this place, but you were so young you didn't remember. We're too busy at the moment, we haven't got enough money, I'll take you when we've got some more money, next time. And she's fed up of all the excuses, and she just wants to escape this bleak, dreary place on the marshes that's all she's ever known.
I wanted to ask you about the 3 magical artefacts in your book. I know when you wrote the 13 books that it started with a charm bracelet.
Yeah.
Are these objects in A Pinch of Magic real objects that you have?
No, they're not. And actually they changed throughout the story. So in the first draft, the bag was always the bag. So there was always a travelling bag. And I'm not entirely sure where that came from. But Fliss's mirror initially was I think it was a rabbit fur stole, which again had been handed down and was very fusty, and Charlie was very upset by that because it was a dead animal, and she kept trying to bury it, not realising that it was quite a valuable thing, that initially its power was to help Fliss be able to steal things really easily without the person being stolen from noticing. And Betty's object was initially a set of dominoes, which was going to allow her to disappear when she set them up and sort of made like a trail of dominoes, but that was all getting a bit too fiddly. So I had to think about other objects that could make somebody disappear and what was symbolic of disappearing, and I just happened to think of Russian dolls and the way they disappear inside each other and hidden away. And I've always really, really loved Russian dolls, so they seem like a perfect object. And when I got the edits back from my publisher, they said, oh, maybe this first style isn't something that's, maybe we could have something more exciting than that. And obviously, Fliss is very vain and quite into her own reflections. I thought, a mirror would be good. So while it's not a terribly original object, there's lots of stories of magic mirrors, I felt like it was the best option for Fliss, because it does seem like something that she would carry around with her anyway.
There's another story within the story, isn't there?
Yeah.
Without giving too much away, tell us a little bit about that.
So the other story it's kind of the opposite to the Widdershins, really, because when the girls are trying to find out about how they're going to undo their curse, we get to see the Widdershins' sisterhood and their relationship tested, but ultimately we see how strong their love and their bond is with each other, and they might argue, they might bicker, but they're always there for each other. But not every sibling relationship is like that, and we get to see in the past, there's sort of another story that's unfolding in the past through flashbacks, and we get to see the relationship between another pair of sisters, where jealousy sets in, and it shows you the damage that can do, and how it becomes something so ugly and destructive.
Which is very fairy tale, isn't it?
Yeah.
A lot of those binary opposites in fairy tales are rivalries between siblings.
Yeah. The thing about sisters is you know all each other's strongest character traits. You know each other inside and out. And you're also capable, and I can say this because I'm the youngest of three sisters. When you fight, it's ugly, really ugly, because you know each other's weak points as well.
Tell me a little bit about having these two narratives and how you made the decision to kind of splice them together and those connection points. Did that come sort of chronologically through the book, or did you have to go back and think about where you were going to thread this other narrative through?
No, I tend to write chronologically anyway. I tend to write, my stories are quite linear when they're written, even though quite often there's a link to the past. So the way it appears in the book was pretty much how it was written. There were a couple of scenes that were shifted. Sort of when you're doing your edits, you think, actually the reader needs this information a little bit sooner, or they need this excitement a little bit sooner, so let's move that scene forward or that chapter, or whip that chapter out. And I think the section that's based in the past, where the curse all originates, that was pretty much as I first wrote it. I think there were maybe one or two extra sections that I put in, because when I write a story, I tend to just try and get it all down rather than go back and keep fiddling with it, otherwise I never get it finished. So I think I did my first draft, and I think I put a note to my editor that I need to go back and add in a section where this is going to happen, just to make it clearer for her, so that these characters didn't just suddenly pop up out of nowhere, and there needed to be a little bit more of an introduction to them.
I'd like to talk about Betty a little bit more. She's a very strong character, and I don't know, you grow very close to her as a reader. I think she's written with incredible warmth from you, and I wondered whether she grew in your imagination as you were writing her, and in what way she might have developed through that process of writing.
Yeah, I mean, she definitely developed. I have to admit, when I'm working on stories, the first draft is always very plot based for me. So I'm thinking about the logistics of how the magic's going to work, what the characters need to be, how they can work together. So quite often their personalities are developed from what I need from the story and how I need characters to conflict and work together. So at the start, I don't think I was particularly... some characters, you get an immediate affinity with them as soon as you start to write. So with Tanya in the 13 Treasures, I felt much closer to Tanya from the start. And with Betty, it was something that came more through the edits, where I developed her personality more. And one thing that I failed to do in the first couple of drafts was to show Betty's internal narrative. I was trying to show everything through her actions and not showing much what was going on in her head.
Interesting.
And that was something that one of the editors pointed out, and I was like, aha, that's what's missing. And then once I put that in, I did feel a lot closer to her. But I think the real love for the characters was the sisterly bond and how it relates to me and my own sisters and how their personalities are all so different. And I think the way that they bounce off each other and the bickering that's there and the little in-jokes that they have, that's the warmth of the story for me. And that's something that I'm really enjoying working on the next book as well.
I thought that there were echoes of other stories in there. Now, sometimes you bring that as a reader and it's not there necessarily for the writer. So, for instance, when they escape, there's an escape from the tower at one point, and I felt echoes of Great Expectations there. I could almost feel Magwitch coming out of the marsh.
I've actually read
it. You didn't even have that in there. But that's what happens, isn't it, with readers? You always make connections to other things that you've read. What connections do you see in the book between your own work and other stories?
Well, I think there's definitely like a fairy tale elements, because I've always got a fondness for fairy tales. So you've got the tower and the idea of the witch locked in the tower. So obviously that's a very strong fairy tale element. There was a book that I read a few years ago called Poison, which is set on marshes, and there was sort of a lot of witches and fairies in that, and I was reminded of that when I was writing and doing the setting of Crowstone, because it's also on marshes, and but that wasn't why I decided to do it. I decided to do it because of islands that are quite close to where I live, like in Walden called Osea Island, which are all on the estuary and very marshy, and the tides go in and out, so there's kind of a lot of my surroundings that go into the stories. Other story, obviously the magic mirror, being able to sort of see things in a mirror, again, that's not a particularly original idea, but again, I chose it because I thought it was well suited to Fliss, and I think in a way it's quite a nice thing for a reader to get a familiar element, and I think, well, I've seen this before, but it's that's not the main crux of the story. It's it's been used in a slightly different way, or the characters are different. So I think you take a little bit of books, stories that you enjoy. You sort of take a little bit of influence from all of them, really. There was a book that I absolutely love, which is for slightly older readers. It's just been reissued, actually, called The Merry-Begot by Julie Hearn.
It has, yeah.
And it's one of my favourite books. I was actually asked to give a quote for the cover of the new edition, which I was honoured to do. And it's got a lovely new cover. And that's all about fairies and witches, and it's set in the 1600s. And there's a very toxic relationship between two sisters in that. So I think there's probably parallels between that and Pinch of Magic as well.
But like Julie Hearn's book, I think your magic has that sense of jeopardy and darkness and not to be messed with. Those fairies that you don't quite know whether you trust them or not. So people might not realise, but as well as being a writer, you've been an editor yourself. So how do you find it being on the other side of the editing process?
I'd say I'm pretty good at being edited, because having been on the other side, I know how important it is, and I know that when something is mentioned, editors don't mention it for no reason. But generally, I mean, if it's a little thing and nobody else mentions it, you might think, oh, actually, no, I think I do want to keep that bit. But on the whole, I tend to listen to what they say, and I don't really. I think there's some people that don't like being edited at all, but I quite like it, because I feel like you get your first draft down, and it's quite a lonely place to be, because you don't, unless you've got somebody in your family or a friend or another writer that you know well enough to read it, you're kind of on your own with it, and you don't know if it's any good. So when you get those first comments from your editor, that you're feeling it out, and whether you're testing it out, and they're your first reader, really, so you have to take them seriously. And I think the fact that when I first got my agent and my publisher, Simon & Schuster with 13 Treasures, it was all around the same time that I started to work as an editor as well. So I was learning about both sides simultaneously, which was really, really helpful for me. So I was seeing, I was sort of working on other people's books at the same time, the same things were happening with my books. So I think publishers generally find me quite easy to work with because they know that I know how it works.
Interesting.
So, yeah, it's been a really good experience.
And what was the editing process like for this particular book?
It was... my first drafts are very overwritten, usually a bit too long, and there's usually a few tangents that I go off on because I don't plan every single detail. So I plan enough to know where I'm going, but then I'm open to ideas along the way. So I can get myself in a few pickles if an idea kind of pops up, and then I kind of want to cram everything in. So really a lot of the editing process for me is to hone it all back, trim back all those little branches that have shot off from, the tree trunk, which is the main story, and get it all back in shape. There's the prisoner called Colton who claims to know how to break the curse, and in the first draft there was actually a chapter that was told straight after the girls meet him in prison. I kind of, from that point, I went with Colton and did a chapter from his perspective. And in the original version, Colton was kind of a bit psychically linked to the witch in the tower. So he'd been kind of seeing her in his dreams and hearing her voice and kind of scratching things on his prison cell wall that he'd heard her saying. So there was sort of this, like, a bit of a psychic link between them because they'd both been unfairly treated. And my editors didn't want me to do it that way. They felt that it was kind of a little bit confusing and like we should have it a little bit more ambiguous as to what his real intentions were, because you kind of don't really find out what he's all about until a bit further on in the story. So we kind of wanted to leave the reader unsure as to whether the girls could really trust him or not and what was going on in his head. So I think that was definitely the right decision.
And I can say from a reader's point of view that you are kept guessing with that.
Yeah, and I think that's something that works really well. Sort of, there's nothing better than a character then you're never really sure whether to trust them or not. So I think that was definitely a good decision. There was also a chapter later on in the book where Fliss and Charlie are separated from Betty. And they're in a lot of danger, and again I went off with them to show what happened. I mean, technically that could probably be used as a deleted scene because the story was the same, you heard about it from them rather than saw it through their eyes. So we stayed with Betty instead and had her wondering and had her fear about what was happening to her sisters rather than finding it all out. So I think it was mainly about keeping the narrative with our main character rather than allowing other characters to kind of have it from their viewpoint. And I think, again, that's a stronger thing to do.
It also seems to me, reading your books, because I enjoyed your naming of your characters so much. Is it Winter
Bates,
Fingertip. I mean, I just love your naming. Is that something that you enjoy doing, finding the name for the character?
Yeah, that's one of my favourite parts, naming characters and places. And actually, a little bit of trivia: Betty, all the sisters' names changed from the first draft. So initially, Fliss was called Fenella, and it was going to be Ella for short, and Charlie's always been Charlotte, but initially she was a Lotta, and I thought that's too pretty for Charlie. She needs to be more tomboyish, so she changed to Charlie. And Betty was initially Bonnie Widdershins, but I decided to rename her after Betty, who was my mum, and she was very much like Betty Widdershins, or very brave and impetuous, and the book's dedicated to her as well. But yeah, I love naming places, and I'm always on the lookout for new place names. So people that live in Essex probably see quite a few that crop up in my books, and I think, oh, that's where she got that from. So there's constantly stuff in my books.
Tell us about Crowstone.
Well, Crowstone is the name of a local road about 10 minutes from where I live, and it's where I park when I go to my local library. and I almost bought a house in Crowstone Road. And funnily enough, my mum and my sisters lived there years ago as well. So it's sort of quite big in our family. And I just love the name of it, Crowstone. It just sounds very mysterious and a little bit dark. And it kind of brings to mind crows on rocks, like craggy rocks. And that was the idea, behind the island. And Hangman's Wood is just up the road from Crowstone. Hangman's Wood was used in the 13 Treasures books.
So, Michelle, what do we have to look forward to next?
Well, I'm currently working on a sequel to Pinch of Magic, and I think Melissa Castrillon is doing the cover, the same. So it should be just as lovely.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
It is really lovely. There's so many people that have commented on it, and I think it was a real impulse buy as well when it was Book of the Month in Waterstones, because it was on the counters. And I was hearing a lot of tweets where, I just popped into Waterstones to collect a book and I saw this on the counter and it was so lovely I had to pick it up. So
a book jacket really does matter, doesn't it?
It does, and this one's had such a brilliant reception. I think it's probably had the best reception out of all my books. I'm just thrilled with how it's doing.
And also a younger series too, I understand.
Yeah, so I've got a new series coming out with Stripes Books in 2020, which is for readers of 6+, which is called Midnight Magic. And it's all about a little black cat called Midnight who, because she's born at midnight and because she's a black cat, which we associate with witches, she's able to do magic, not like her brothers and sisters. And her mum is a little bit kind of put out by that, so they sort of do a bit of a moonlight flit and leave her to her own devices, and so she's kind of left all alone, and she's only got this dusty old broom that's in this barn where they've been born. So, with a few magical winks and tail shakes, this broom comes to life and becomes her friend Twiggy, and then they end up finding this little girl Trixie, and it's the start of all their adventures together. So there's 3 books, or there's going to be 3 books at the moment. 2 of them are written. The other one I still need to do, but hopefully, depending on how they're received, there'll be more of those as well. So I'm quite excited about that because it's the first time I've written for that age group. Yeah. But while the word count is much shorter, so those books are typically the length of one of the chapters in my novels. I made it really difficult for myself because they're all in rhyme. So 2,500 words is quite a lot when you've got to make them rhyme, as I discovered. But
absolutely.
Really enjoyed doing those, though.
Brilliant. Well, we look forward to reading those too. Nice that you are diversifying and writing for a wider age group.
It's like having a little holiday. You finish one book and then you're like, got this now, and it's completely different, although again still magic. So I can't seem to get away from magic.
Michelle, thank you so much for talking to us in the Reading Corner today.